Okay, check. I don't know whether it's plugged in or not. But okay, let's go. Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So in this video, I'm gonna share some slides regarding my final term test. It's handled by Miss Ruiza, a lecturer of Pamulang University. Okay, let's start it. So in this slide, I'm gonna bring up racism's issue. So here, as you can see, it's actually I have the hard file or the physical book, but I just forgot to bring it with me. But I still have the pictures anyway, so it doesn't matter. So the book's called "Taking Stands: The Civil Rights Movements" by Lini Baudish. I know I pronounced it wrong, but it's international fiction. So this the civil rights movements for Africans Americans in the United States. So some people may heard of Rosa Parks and Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. So these two people are actually the fundamental or probably important persons in periods in the United States history for all African Americans and uh, equality. So the civil rights movements occurred during 1954 to 1965. This movement, right? But okay, a simply backgrounds and in conclusion, or to put it in short, this African Americans or especially the Africans had gone through a lot of hard times, especially in uh, what we call the no surfer, but the slavery. Okay, we're talking about slavery periods when the United States. There are also cool books called, or the era called, um, slavery slavery periods of African. Yeah. So without any further ado, let's go jump to the presentation. So in the slavery movements, backgrounds, of course. The in civil rights movement for African American in United States or slavery periods, uh, the Africans, of course, the blacks, they always they're always looked down by whites. So there are distinctive treatments by society and also by the governments or the institutional structures. According, I'm gonna move. Well, according to the books and the definitions, there are also some questions and tricky questions. What's actually racism and racial discrimination? What makes them different? So, in my perspectives, based on this definition, will be later on introduced and clarified. My opinions, racisms and racial discriminations have closely related to one another or to each other. Why? Okay, let's talk about racism first. Racism is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the physical properties. So physical properties such as skin color, hair structure, and physical body or anything else. So this is basically structuring opportunity based on people's physical properties. On the other hand, Racial discriminations is a differential treatment on a basis of race that disadvantages a racial groups. What does that mean? So it's a different treatment on a basis race. So people are born in a different race and they are disadvantages and always of again looked down by another race as is explained in racism. And according to the Golden Allport, I know I pronounced it wrong, so I don't know how to pronounce his names. In 1954, states that racial discrimination is considered when an individual or groups of people behave negatively towards members of other racials. Again, discriminations and racisms is closely related, in my opinion. Well, where were where was it? Okay, negatively towards members. This is actually the con- a behavior of persons towards another racial groups. So this includes verbal communication, verbal actions, verbal assaults, and so on. Verbal, something that can be said. Sorry, there has to be comma here. There's a comma between verbal and antagonism. Antagonism means you act negatively towards another person. This is called antagonism. Avoidance. Avoidance is a tendency or behavior not to be in on the same page or with another people or another race in racial discrimination. So avoidance, people tend to avoid this or specific distinctive groups of people. Segregation is a system where two people or two groups of people are separated from one another in many in many terms. Physical attacks, of course, this is different from a verbal, but physical attack is considered more a violence where people can attack one another. Here, physical attack and extermination. What does that mean? Extermination means it's a system where or situation where people are destroy or assassinate or murder by the systems. I mean, it is caused by several issues, specific issue that can be brought up. But furthermore, discrimination may also occur as the result of institutional procedures rather than individual behaviors. Again, racism and racial discrimination are related, as we can see in definition here. Discrimination may also occur as a result of institutional procedures. So institutional procedures has a tendency or probably one of the causes of discrimination racial discriminations. So according to Gordon Allport, 1954, page 55 to 56, reference the National Academy's Press retrieved from, this is the website. Okay, moving on, chapter 1. In civil rights movement for African Americans in the United States, chapter 1 discuss the segregation. What is segregation here? Mean, after the Civil War, there was actually a civil war in the United States, and also probably before the slavery periods, the governments passed the law to keep blacks separate from the whites, known as Jim Crow. This is known as Jim Crow or segregation. So this segregation called Jim Crow, where uh, blacks and whites are separated in publicly. We later on in discuss. So it segregated blacks from the whites in public places. Most southern states passed this law and was supported by courts. So most of this part of the southern states passed this law, passed the Jim Crow. Well, I communicate also with one of the in online game called PUBG, and I communicated with a lot of Americans, my friends, because they are my friends in PUBG, and then we discussed a little bit about discriminations, probably a lot of racisms, and most people in North Carolina, South Carolina are racist. They are racist towards one uh, or one people. Most of the times is blacks and whites. Not only that, Asian also. So then basically if you're not from the area, so you're gonna face lots of problems, especially in racism and racial discriminations. So including public conversations such as railroads, public drinks at the movies, etc., between blacks and whites, as we can see from the pictures here. I'm sorry. We can see from the pictures. Here we see black and whites are segregated from a public places or drink public places. Second, the segregations affected education. So in educational segregations, this segregation also affected the education. South African American schools were held in the churches because they're not allowed to go to schools in local school. Went to one schools and whites went to the different schools. It's equal, right? People ask, it's equal, right? No. Why is it now? Because it's separation, but not equal. It's because white schools books and buildings are way better than the blacks. It's a matter of the facts. If you find out a little more information about these ones, it's segregation but not equal. Moreover, blacks often had to travel far to go to the school, so it is not equal because they have to go to travel to school farther than whites did, since they weren't allowed at the local schools. So one of the cases experienced by Linda Browns. So here it pause. Linda Brown and the Topeka Board of Education. I don't know how to pronounce that one, but Topeka Board of Education is the name of place basically. Linda Brown was a 7-year-old girl in the pictures who lives in a Topeka. Here, this one, she's the person. Had to cross a railroad tracks to get a bus stop for school. So then basically she had to travel far to get to the bus stop. In in the 1950s, an organization called National Association for the Advancements of Colorado People, simply means NAACP, stood against the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. So they wanted to have uh, equal education segregation. There will be no segregation in the Topeka. Talking about it, the next slide, Thurgood Marshall. He was a lawyer for NAACP, arguing that the separation of schools and public places were not equal. He stated that the court's policy didn't give African American equal rights. It's true. Anyway, Linda's father was Oliver Brown. Joined the lawsuit. What does lawsuit mean? Meaning he brought this case to the law courts for justice or legal decisions, complaining about equal rights. The case then went to the United States Supreme Court in 1952. Afterwards, in 1954, Linda won her case. All people, all children, here, childrens are open or are welcome to all welcome to schools. There were no segregations, races in children. But however, the little a place called the Little Rock Nines, or this is actually the Little Rock Nines, 1, 2, 3, 4. In a picture, there are 9 people or 9 students who study together. Although all schools weren't open to all children, in the case of Linda, am I right? In the case, yep, children are open. Children are welcomes in schools, whether it's public places or whether it's public schools or not. Although all schools weren't open to children, were open to children from all races, the Supreme Court didn't say much about how and when the segregation should happen. This segregation means combined, basically combined. There will be no there will be no superior equal rights than another one. Many cities didn't integrate. Integrate means combine all races in their schools for years. Therefore, the little Rock Nine studied together at home as they weren't allowed to enter the high school. So here in the picture, we see 9 African American students who study together at homes at one place because they're not allowed to enter the high school. Why they're not allowed? Because many cities didn't integrate these combined races. That's worse. Just like pictures on the right. Okay, got that. Elizabeth. Okay, one of the example is Elizabeth Ackford. She was one of the little nine rock students. Decided went to school on September 4, 1957, but it turned out that what many little rock citizens here, the citizens of Little Rock, whites in particular, they went against the integrations, mix all races. So then, since they know the uh, Patika where Linda lives, integrated schools means mixing all the races. Here in Little Rocks, they don't, or they didn't think so. They just want to stood against uh, blacks. So, including the governor of Arkansas, he means the governor of Arkansas sent down the National Guard to keep the African American student out. Elizabeth, of course, she is one of the worst. She is scared as the crowd protested with angry faces while yelling at her. As we can see in the picture here, Elizabeth is actually one of the black students here, or one of the blacks people, one of the blacks, and surrounded by whites. The mothers, of course, because they protested. They don't want their children to have schools or to study with the blacks. That's worse. So the worst case scenario was when she insisted to enter a school, but the guard raised their weapon as if she was a threat, and she only brought a book, but or I don't know somehow because they are actually assigned to keep the blacks out of the school. Eventually, she was guided by 2 adults who guided her going back to the bus, basically where she came from, along with an angry crowd, as we can see in the picture. Moving on, Ernest. I don't know how to. It's just actually Ernest Green. Ernest Green is the name of persons. He African American students. Finally, the mayor of the Little Rock is the mayor of means the governor who people selected to be in charge. Asked for support from President Dwight. On September 23, 1957, the 9 students entered the school with a soldier behind them for the rest of the year. So then, after Mayor asking for help from the President Dwight, then the soldiers who stood against the blacks, now they are behind them. They're on the same page, and in case they got an order from the government, president, of course. With that being said, although whites had a hatred of the blacks, they really hate blacks. They don't want. Sometimes insulted them, even until made a physical assault. Passionately. So, in spite of these situations, an African American finally graduated from the Central High School on May 29th, 1958, by the names of Ernest Green in a picture beside. Chapter 2. I know I keep going on and on. African American leaders believed that the best way to change things was through civil disobedience. What does that mean? Civil disobedience means a form of a protest in which people refuse to obey the laws because the law said blacks are not allowed to mix up with the whites, whether in public or education. So the actions are not violent, which is actually in form or the term of protest, but not violently. People act, people accept to be arrested and punishment for their actions. So the protesters are sincerely uh, accepted or reasonably arrested for the action. So who are the protesters? Protesters are blacks and some of the whites here, as we can see from the pictures, but most often the majority of the protesters are blacks. Rosa Parks and the bus boycott. So here is only there is no story, written story as the previous pictures, previous slides. But Rosa Parks was arrested for for refusing to give up her seat. So in brief, as I can remember from from the book, Rosa is actually one of the African American citizens, and she was on a bus, and there is a wife wanted to sit down, and they wanted to take over her seat, but she refused it. She didn't want to give it in. That's why Rosa Parks is one of the protectors and the boycotts, right? This is actually boycotts and sit-in. Because of that, she was arrested. Sit-ins and the green borough for this is typo, so ship it. The sits in, it's a phrasal verb, means you sit and in, and the Greensboro for is a name of person, I think, or name of community, a place. Another way to protest racial inequality was sit in. We sat, as they say, we sat at a lunch counter where the blacks never sat before, and the people started to look at us. It was our it was our intended to sit there until they decided to serve us. So the next day we came over with 15 people, and the third day we maybe come over with 150 people. That's a lot. And this protest spread to other cities because this is the actions of the for people here. Simply means simple story. These four people, African American, try to sit in the bar counter local local place, restaurant, let's say, where people eat together or whatever. They sit down. As they say, we sit down where blacks never sat before. So there weren't any blacks to sit there because blacks were not allowed, and this is considered not the place. And it's our intent to sit there until they decided to serve us. So that being said, blacks never been served before in restaurants or public places. Or what we say, pub, POB. POB is a hanging out place for American. Chapter 3. Moving towards the resolutions, in 1963, demonstrations in Birmingham's, Alabama wanted the segregation to end. So here, Dr. King, or the famous ones, arrested for participating or for his participation to be one of the demonstrations. On May 3, 1963, the police acted violently towards the demonstrators. As we can see in the pictures, they actually spray They sprayed about it. Is it water or probably gas, whatever it is? But they act violently, so they consider as if their protesters or demonstrations are threats. So moving towards the resolutions, the end of the story. Here, this is actually Dr. King, the guy that I mentioned before. So support began to grow for the movements on one of the okay, this is actually one, not on. One of the biggest one of the biggest was on August 28, 1963. More than 200 people participated in this walk. So 200 people participated in protesting, the demonstrating, speaking out for the blacks or inequality voice. So Martin Luther King, this one is this guy, spoke out for the equal rights at the March on Washington. And coming to the end of the story, the leader in the civil rights movement, so there has to be a leader. Johnson was elected vice president under President John F. Kennedy. So Johnson was the vice president. The president was John F. Kennedy. But after John Kennedy murder in 1963, Johnson became a president. Here, as a lot of people know, John Kennedy or John F. Kennedy was murdered in a shooting accidents in American campaign or something, but he was murdered. London Johnson, Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act on July 2nd in 1964. Its purpose was to stop discrimination race, based on race, no race. Okay, so based on the stories I just mentioned in the slides, racial racism, racisms and racial discriminations still happens around the world. We can't avoid that. It's inevitable and unavoidable because people have their own perspective towards one group of people, and sometimes people are evil. There are two kinds of people in the world, good and bad. Okay, that's all from my presentation. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I hope it was recorded. Let's check it out. Stop recording.